Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Logos Project. In today's video, we're going to cover the historical, moral, and canonical aspects of schism and whether or not the Society of St. Pius X meets those categories. Andrew Bartel and John Salza join me to discuss this topic. Andrew and John, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Anytime. So to begin this conversation, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you. Could you maybe tell the audience and discuss the moral and historical aspects of the sin of schism?
Yes, certainly. So just to introduce the conversation for any of those who are unfamiliar with the history of the Society of St. Pius X, the society was founded by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre in 1970 as a association for the formation of priests, and he founded that association with the approval of the bishop, the local bishop. And so the history of the society begins firmly within the Catholic Church, as do most schisms. What started to happen is similar to every other historical division that has happened. There's been this pattern of tension, conflict, and then separation. And that is what happened with the Society of St. Pius X. There began to arise tensions between the French bishops and Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre because there were jealousies going on between those bishops because he was taking seminarians who would normally be going to their seminaries. And so they began to petition the Pope or to influence and ask for a investigation into the seminary, especially since there were indications that the Archbishop was not faithfully passing on the teachings of the Second Vatican Council or the directives, and that he was nurturing attitudes that were hostile to the Reformed rites and the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. So the Pope sent an investigation to the seminary, and it came back. And they saw everything was in order, that the Archbishop was in fact running the seminary in an exemplary fashion, and they went back and gave a positive report. But the Archbishop was so scandalized by some of the things, and the seminarians in their interactions with these two papal appointees who came to do the investigation, that the Archbishop subsequently wrote his famous 1974 declaration, in which he said that he adhered to eternal Rome, but that he rejected the Rome, the temporal Rome, the modern Rome of neo-Protestant and modernist tendencies. And this was really when the things began to go awry in the history of the Society of St. Pius X, because that declaration was publicly released, and then it began to create even more conflicts, especially with the Pope. And after that, the Pope asked the Archbishop to withdraw the declaration, which he refused to do, and then the Archbishop was warned that he would receive the canonical punishments that would follow from that, and he refused to do so, and he was told to no longer ordain priests, and eventually the society was suspended. And I know I'm kind of cutting this a little bit short for the sake of time, but ultimately what happened is the society was suppressed. The Archbishop was told not to ordain priests, and he continued to do so anyway. So this began a chain reaction of actions on the part of the Archbishop and on the part of his priests from that moment on, of a continued state of resistance, of disobedience and of acting in such and such a way that was not only apart and did not submit to the authority of the Roman pontiff, but also withdrew more and more from communion with regular Catholics. So for many people who are familiar with my debate with Jeff Kassman, I argued in that debate, not from the canonical side, although we'll be getting into the canonical issues today as well, since we have a canon lawyer, John Salza, with us. But I was arguing from the moral argument, because before schism is a crime, it has its genesis as a sin. It is actually a part of the moral law. As St. Augustine said, schism is actually a sin against fraternal charity. And there are multi-layered aspects to schism that the Society of St. Pius X, in its justifications for its own actions, does not cover. And I would propose that the Society of St. Pius X has actually created a false definition of schism in order to distance itself from the accusations of schism. If for anyone who's familiar with the 2012 conference that the Society of St. Pius X gave on the papacy, there was a talk given there by one of the society priests, Father Esquerra, who is a professor. And in it, he actually says that the Great Schism, because he was giving a talk on the Great Western Schism, he actually claimed that it wasn't a schism, that term wasn't actually correct, because in the Great Schism, it didn't necessarily entail a rejection of the Pope's authority to command or of the Pope's authority. Rather, it was a disciplinary and governmental issue. And so he actually makes the distinction and says that he doesn't believe that this was actually a schism per se. So you can already begin to see that the SSPX has a false definition of schism that does not go with the accepted historical definition given by the church, and as can be found in both the moral law in terms of the sin of schism, as well as in canon law. The definition of schism is identical. And this definition of schism, for anyone who's not familiar, is schism is a withdrawal of submission to the Pope, to the sovereign pontiff, and of communion with those under him. And so there are two aspects or elements to schism. There's the horizontal, which is withdrawing submission to the Pope, and then there's also the horizontal aspect of schism, which is withdrawal of communion. And this includes, as I'm sure John Salza will get into today as well, this includes submission to the authority of your local bishop. So if you operate outside of the authority of your local bishop, that also constitutes an act of schism as well. And that's part of that is, again, that's both part of submission to the Holy Father, who appointed that bishop, as well as the horizontal aspect of refusing communion with the spiritual leader who represents Christ in one's diocese. Other elements of withdrawing submission or with communion have to do with the unity of faith, unity of worship, and unity of governance. So refusing to worship with other Catholics according to approved rites because you believe those rites are wrong or harmful or sacrilegious is also a schismatic attitude and an act. To offer the Mass as a priest outside of the authority of the local bishop is also an act of schism. To refuse to profess the same official creeds and to accept the same councils and authority are also acts of schism. Also, to refuse to accept the code of canon law or certain parts of the code of canon law that have been promulgated by the Holy Father, and to set up tribunals in independent tribunals from the authority of the bishop is also schismatic. And that is something that John Salza will also be getting into today. So let me give you the definition from St. Thomas Aquinas on the sin of schism, since that is what I am going to be addressing. So Thomas Aquinas says, quote, "The sin of schism is, properly speaking, a special sin for the reason that the schismatic intends to sever himself from that unity which is the effect of charity, because charity not only unites one person to another with the bond of spiritual love, but also the whole church in unity of spirit, close quote. And then St. Thomas Aquinas goes on to give the definition, which I just gave you, of schism: withdrawal of submission to the Holy Father and of communion with those under him. So, according to these criteria, have the SSPX been guilty of this sin publicly? And that's and again, just to clarify, because many people believe, because of getting into the moral law, that you're dealing with a subjective matter. And that is not the case. We are not judging the subjective intentions or whether or not anyone is guilty of the sin subjectively, because you can have formal and material heresy and material schism. And then those who are guilty of material schism are not necessarily guilty of the sin as far as the guilt of that sin. However, you can judge when somebody, especially an organization that has come together to pursue certain ends, you can judge whether their actions are in line with the moral law of God. And proof of this is that, and this goes for individuals as well, not just groups and bodies, but also individuals. So a proof of this is that you have to be able to judge whether or not somebody is guilty of a manifest sin in order to avoid the near occasion of sin and bad companions. If you were not able to judge that, you would not be able to protect your soul, your soul and the souls of those for whom you're responsible. So we are in fact required to judge. We do not judge as God judges, but we do have to judge as God gives us the right and responsibility to judge. So with regards to the SSPX, the Archbishop Lefebvre, his words and his actions, as well as the Society of St. Pius X, let's just look at some of the things that they have said and some of the things that they have done, so we can have an understanding of whether or not these actions would fit the criteria that I have given and that John will give later. So the 1974 declaration by Archbishop Lefebvre, and in it he states, quote, "We refuse and have always refused to follow the Rome of the neo-Protestant trend clearly manifest through Vatican II and later in all the reforms born of it," close quote. As I've said in other videos and elsewhere, as well as in my debate, this is something that is condemned multiple times by the Church, but notably by Pope Pius XII in his encyclical on the mystical body of Christ, Mystici Corporis Christi. You cannot separate the spiritual and physical aspects of the Church. And so this is not only, is this a heresy, but it creates two rival churches. And this is indicative of an attitude of us versus them, that they are in fact a separate church, that the church that is identified with the council, which was over 2,000 bishops throughout all of the world, as well as the successor of Peter, the Pope, and all of the Catholics who have subsequently accepted the reforms, are considered to be a separate church by these statements. Another one from the Archbishop at his homily at Lille, he said, quote, "We are not in a state of schism, for it is we who continue the Catholic Church. It is those who carry out the reforms who are in a state of schism," close quote. So again, you see that those who carry out the reforms, which include both all of the bishops, all of the priests, all throughout the world, in all of the countries, and the faithful have received them, are in a state of schism. That is the claim that the Archbishop is making. And he is identifying the SSPX as the true Catholic Church. Again, in an interview he gave at an Italian weekly, Europeo, he says, quote, "It is not I who have activated a schism. It is the Church of Rome, the Church of the Council, which has separated itself from Christ," close quote. So again, you see the same claim. You can see when you look at the statements made by Martin Luther, by the original Orthodox who separated from Rome, you can find these exact same claims. It is not we who are in schism, but Rome who is in schism. So you can see this historical precedent in these statements. And this is not limited just to statements from the Archbishop. In following the excommunications, there was an open letter signed by 24 SSPX superiors. It was an open letter to Cardinal Ganton in 1988. Quote, "To be publicly associated with the sanction of excommunication would be a mark of honor and a sign of orthodoxy before the faithful, who have a strict right to know that the priests they approach are not in communion with a counterfeit church." Close quote. So again, you see, there it is. The attitude is that there are two different churches. So when the Society of St. Pius X is making the claims that, oh no, we're part of the church, that is a facade. It is a lie. You are being lied to. These are serious things. So to finish off with quotes from Archbishop Lefebvre, there are two others that indicate this. I'm giving you multiple quotes so you can see these are not isolated quotes. You can find this all throughout the writings, all throughout the decades. So again, Lefebvre says, quote, "Only a milieu entirely detached from modern errors and morals can permit renewal. Our family represent what is left of the church." Close quote. So these are the words of the Archbishop and of the leadership of the Society of St. Pius X, and these are the common views held by the priests. So let's look at the actions now that we've looked at the words. So in 1975, the SSPX was suppressed, but continued to operate anyway, even though it was suppressed both by the local bishop and that was upheld by the Pope. In the ordinations of June 1976, even though they were expressly forbidden by the Holy Father, the Archbishop proceeded with them anyway. All the ordinations and sacraments between 1976 and 1988 offered by the Archbishop, who was suspended, and by the priests who he ordained, who were also suspended, were illicit, were repeated acts of disobedience, a continued withdrawals of submission over the years. All of this culminated, of course, in the 1988 Episcopal Consecrations, in which Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, against the command and entreaties of Pope John Paul II, proceeded to ordain or consecrate 4 bishops, setting up, even though he claimed that he was not intentionally setting up a parallel church, he was in fact setting up a church that could exist independently from Rome. And this was why in Ecclesia Blog, the motu proprio issued by Pope John Paul II, he identifies it as a schismatic act, because you cannot separate jurisdiction. This is a false separation of jurisdiction from ministry. You cannot separate those, because the bishop is therefore has to govern. He has to direct those who he is ministering the sacraments to. So even though they may not claim to have an ordinary jurisdiction, they are practically in the day-to-day practice, they are in fact living as a separate and parallel church, because you cannot separate the governance from the life of governance, from the life of faith, and from the life of worship. Besides these actions, the SSPX has rejected important doctrines of Vatican II, important doctrinal developments. As a matter of fact, it even rejects them as heretical. And all those other, the ones that it doesn't reject as heretical, it ignores the other pastoral directives of the council. It rejects the Novus Ordo Missae, the Missal of 1969, officially promulgated by Pope Paul VI. Not only does it reject it, but it actually, the SSPX actually claims that it is harmful to your faith and forbids its followers to attend these masses under pain of sin. And you can find this in the books that they publish, such as the prayer book, Spiritual Warfare. You can find in the Examination of Conscience that the question, have I attended a Novus Ordo Missae? And then in official studies, such as Problem of the Liturgical Reform, and on their official website, they say that it actually has elements that are harmful to the faith. They've also rejected the Universal Catechism of the Catholic Church. They've rejected parts of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. They've rejected multiple canonizations that have been done by the popes. And they have also rejected or ignored subsequent encyclicals, apostolic constitutions, and other teaching and pastoral directives that have been issued by the last 5 popes. All of this evidence is readily available by anyone who simply wants to go and look at their website or look at the historical track record of the SSPX or see what they have taught. Finally, that has to do with the vertical aspect of schism. And finally, on the horizontal aspect of schism, they forbid their followers to not attend the Mass, the ordinary Masses, as I said, because they believe that it's harmful to the faith. So they forbid advise their followers not to attend those Masses. But not only that, they even forbid their followers to attend Masses of the Institute of Christ the King, of the Fraternity of St. Peter, as well as other indult Masses, because of their acceptance of Vatican II and their acceptance of the Reformed sacraments. Besides this, as I mentioned, John will get into this as well, but they also do not operate regularly under the local bishops as well. So they do not take direction, nor do they work with the local bishop, except in certain circumstances when it is in their favor. So all of this that I have said can be reduced, you might say, or boiled down into a simple syllogism, which is the society, any person or group of persons that has committed manifest and public acts of schism is a schismatic. The SSPX, the Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and his Society of St. Pius X, and many of its formal adherents who adhere exclusively to the SSPX have been guilty of this public sin. Therefore, they are schismatics. And this reasoning is watertight. And the proof of that, if the priests of the Society of the SSPX or the laity who adhere to them do not want to accept the syllogism, then they need to actually cease and desist their resistance of Rome, because they are resisting Rome according to the exact same principles, or they are resisting those in the church or those harmful influences in the church, either heretical or schismatic, as has often been brought up, the German church or Father James Martin or other vagabond or renegade organizations running around who are supposedly calling themselves Catholics. And they have to cease and desist of their judgment of them, because this is just applying the exact same criteria. And all I'm asking, and all any of us, and John and any of us are asking, is that we apply these same principles both to the SSPX and any organizations who are behaving in like manner, as well as to the dissidents on the modernist and progressive side. And with that, I will hand it over to John Salza to get into the canonical case of things.
Excellent presentation, Andrew. Thank you very much. I can already hear all of the numerous objections to everything you just said. Don't worry, audience, we will get into these objections. Trust me, all 3 of us have heard them before. So without further ado, John, I'll kick it off with the first question here to turn to the canonical side of all this. What does canon law say, John, about schism? And how do we know SSPX adherents would be in schism?
Sure. I'll just kind of clarify where I'm coming from and my credentials on this.
Go ahead.
I'm a civil lawyer with the background in canon law, having studied it extensively. I audited coursework at the local seminary here in canon law. And when I reached my conclusions on this, I did submit those judgments to canonists, both locally, including my local archbishop here, as well as canonists in Rome. So to the extent any other lawyers want to come and debate these issues, I'm happy to do so, but they stand on solid footing and the position of the church. Canon 751 provides the definition of schism, and really it parallels how Andrew presented the moral side of schism. Effectively, schism is the refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff or refusing communion with those subject to him. Okay, those are the elements, we would call them the canonical elements, which if satisfied would meet the crime of schism as opposed to the sin of schism. And when you commit a crime, there's consequence to that in the external forum, the ecclesiastical forum. So the question then becomes, how can we show that the society meets the elements specified in Canon 751? And as Andrew alluded to, refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff is not refusing his authority in principle. That's a SSPX talking point that's totally false. If you refuse the Pope's authority in principle, you are a heretic. You don't acknowledge that the Pope has the authority. So schism isn't that. And frankly, I've heard a couple of bishops say the SSPX isn't in schism because they don't refuse the Pope's authority in principle. That is not the definition of schism. That would be dealing with heresy. They're schismatic because they do refuse submission to the Roman pontiff by virtue of the fact that they're not in communion with the local bishop. All of the canonists say, how are we in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father? It starts by being subject to the local bishop. And of course, all of the SSPX clergy know and readily admit that they are not in union with the local bishop. In fact, they say the contrary. They say that they are working in opposition to the express will and permission of the local bishop. So clearly, that willful refusal, which is what it's been, as Andrew has pointed out throughout history, this historical withdrawal of submission, not a specific act, but we're talking about decades whereby the leadership of the society and its clergy have withdrawn submission to the local bishops, the episcopacy, the divinely established office that Christ created, puts them in a state of schism. So that is crystal clear. Every society apologist must admit, yeah, you're right, they are not in submission to the local bishop. Secondly, they've also refused the conditions that Rome has offered them for integration into the church. See, so that's again where we get into this refusal of submission. In the external forum, they have refused the conditions to integrate themselves into the church. And again, that is a fact. Now, they can create all kinds of excuses that they think justify that, but the fact is they've refused submission to the Holy Father by refusing conditions of integration. And perhaps the most obvious proof of schism is the fact that the Society of St. Pius X has set up their own tribunal, their own marriage tribunal. They call it the Canonical Commission, the St. Charles Borromeo Canonical Commission. And if you read what Archbishop Lefebvre said toward the end of his life, it was his will that a commission be set up, which it was. And again, all of this is in his writings. He has a letter dated in 1991 on January 15th to Father Schmidberger saying, because the Roman Catholic Church is completely imbued with modernism, we need to, quote, erect substitute authorities, end quote. So this truly is a parallel church. They've set up their own tribunal. Archbishop Lefebvre then claimed that he had the suppletory powers of jurisdiction and that he could confer that jurisdiction upon his bishops and priests to do everything that Christ gave the authority of the church to do and the Holy See to do and the local bishops do. What is that? I mean, the society is now judging whether there are impediments to marriage. They're granting marriage annulments. They're dispensing religious vows. They're lifting censures in the ecclesiastical forum. And they claim, and you can read the writings of Archbishop Lefebvre, Bishop Foyer, and Bishop Tissier. They all say that their judgments have the force of law, that they're true verdicts, that they are matters of binding and loosing authority, and that Roman Catholics, and I'm quoting Bishop Tissier, have no right to go to Novus Ordo tribunals. That is a quote from Bishop Tissier. In other words, the Society of St. Pius X, as true schismatics, say that Catholics don't have a right to go to the Roman Catholic Church. for acts that require jurisdiction and governance from the bishops and the Holy Father. So this is very serious. And on top of that, the society, and you can read this on their websites and other places, they even require their adherents to swear on the Gospels. If they come to their tribunal for, let's say, a marriage case, they're required to swear on the Gospels that they will conform their judgment to the judgment of the society and will not approach a quote-unquote novus ordo tribunal. So if that is not schismatic, then tell me what is, because not even the Protestants went that far. Not even the old Catholics went that far. Most of the sedevacantist haven't gone that far. And this is why Cardinal Burke has said that even though the censure, we'll get into the declared censure was lifted, Cardinal Burke has correctly said, because the contumacy, the obstinacy, the external refusal of submission remains, that means that the society remains in schism. Andrew also talked about the other canonical element. I just referred to the fact that they're not in submission to the Roman Pontiff. And Andrew pointed out, well, they're also refusing communion with those subject to him. That's crystal clear. Archbishop Lefebvre himself was very clear. He made many statements, including one in 1990 on the fraternity. He says, you got to reject the fraternity of St. Peter. The priests repeatedly, at a minimum, cast doubt upon traditional communities. In fact, Father Robinson, has done this repeatedly in the external forum, casting doubt upon this. What we need to look at it, we take it on a case by case, sowing doubt and confusion among the faithful as to whether they can actually attend masses in communion with the local bishop and the Holy Father. So they meet all of the canonical elements of schism under 751. And what that means is, by virtue of having committed the crime of schism, they are excommunicated. And that is a late sententia excommunication. It happens by operation of law under 1364. And that's not my opinion. That is upon the authority of the magisterium of John Paul II. John Paul II stated after the illicit consecrations in Ecclesia Afflicta that whoever adheres to the movement, the Lefebvrean movement, incurs the censure of excommunication. Excommunication for what? For schism. Because not all of the clergy are going around consecrating bishops. Not all of the laity go around consecrating bishops. John Paul II was saying they're incurring the excommunication for schism, because the schismatic act finally severed the ties with the church completely, and hence those who had formally adhered to that are in a state of schism themselves. So I don't think it's possible to say that the clergy of the society are not formally adhering. They all admit that they're formally adhering to the position of Archbishop Lefebvre. Just take a listen to the Crisis series of podcasts they did. Pretty much every society priest says we stand with Archbishop Lefebvre. Our position remains unwavering. We stand in lockstep with Archbishop Lefebvre. And there are also many lay people, as you well know, who are SSPX only people, right? They say, no, we're totally within the society, refuse communion with the entire church, we're SSPX only. So those are the canonical elements. John Paul II himself has said formal adherence results in excommunication. This happens by operation of law, and hence the society and the society clergy, as well as many of the laity, we can't say all of them, but those who formally adhere according to the magisterium of John Paul II are excommunicated for schism.
Thank you, John. My second question for you is somewhat of an objection, right? So how can the SSPX be in schism if Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunication in 2009?
The same way that the Orthodox are in schism, but they're not under declared censure. The same way that the Old Catholics are schismatics, but they're not under a declared censure. The same way the sedevacantists are schismatics, but are not under a declared censure. You see, the Society of St. Pius X would readily admit that the Orthodox are schismatics, and yet their declared censure was lifted in 1965 by Pope Paul VI. You see?
Yep.
So there's a distinction here. Excommunication applies to both the internal and the external forum. This is very important to understand. When I refer to the internal forum, I'm referring to the spiritual bond to the church. Okay, we often refer to that as what binds us to the soul of the church, our interior virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So there's a spiritual bond. And excommunication severs the spiritual bond. There is truly a censure that operates in the internal forum to sever you from the soul of the church. It's not just an external censure. It's very important to understand. The external forum, often I would call it the ecclesiastical forum, refers to the legal bonds. Okay, Andrew, you mentioned them. The profession of faith, the worship, and the governance of the church. Those are called the juridical or legal bonds, which bind us to the body of the church. This distinction between spiritual and legal, soul and body. So even if an excommunication, which was declared by the authority, is lifted, okay, the person still could, through formal adherence, be excommunicated in the internal forum. And that happens when the contumacy, as Cardinal Burke says, persists. This means they're spiritually severed. And this is gravely problematic because it is absolutely necessary for salvation to be spiritually bound to the church through faith, hope, and charity. That's absolutely necessary for salvation. There's no exception. One might be ordered to the church without being a legal member of the church and could still be saved, but there's no exceptions. If you're spiritually severed from the church, you are in a state of damnation. So that's absolutely necessary. And this, objectively speaking, would apply to the clergy of the society, as well as many, although not all, but those who formally adhere, many of the laity within the society. Now, I want to point out that to the extent that the censure of excommunication is applied only to the internal forum, okay, that can be removed through confession, through absolution. If a priest has the faculty to lift censures, when he has the faculty to absolve you in the confessional, it can be removed. So long as one was, and I'll get into this a little bit later, so long as one was a Catholic and was formally received into the church, if they have incurred this excommunication because they formally adhered to the Lefebvrean movement, all they need to do, is go to confession and confess the sin of schism. And if the priest has the faculty, they're reconciled. They're reconciled with the church. What happened with the society bishops is that not only did they incur an automatic excommunication, which is called late sententiae, by operation of the law already passed or judged under the law, but John Paul II also declared it in the external forum. That's called ferende sententiae, that comes from a declaration of authority. And why that was so problematic is that the society bishops, unlike an excommunication in the internal forum, an excommunication that is declared in the external forum must be lifted by the authority in order for them to come back to the church. You see, anybody under a declared excommunication can't simply go into the confessional, okay, because he has been cut off from the body. He is not permitted to enter into the sacramental life of the church. He's completely severed. And so when the excommunication was lifted, Dom, as you mentioned, by Benedict XVI in 2009, that was the first step necessary to effect a reconciliation with the society. That's why Benedict did it, and that's why he says he did it. I want to remove the first and most absolutely necessary step to reconciliation, lift the declared censure, okay? That's what the church does. Now the onus is on the society with the censure being lifted, because before that censure was lifted, they could do nothing. They're dead, okay? Once the censure is lifted, now they can come back so long as they agree to the conditions of the church for full integration, and that means being in submission to the bishop, having the juridical bonds of faith, worship, and governments, etc. So Catholics need to understand that distinction there between the internal and external forum. Just because one is not under a declared censure does not mean one is not excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
Okay. Thank you, John. So next question I have for you, John, if you don't mind, is so can you further explain maybe the juridical bond that is associated with the profession of faith, which is required for membership in the church, right? So how is the bond formed, and how is it severed?
Well, that's a great question. When we hear a lot from trads, the profession of faith, and there's a couple ways to approach this. First of all, when they use that term, they're often demonstrating their Protestant ecclesiology. When they say all you need to do is profess the true faith and you're a member of the Catholic Church, well, that's false, because that's a Protestant ecclesiology. But it also actually misstates what the profession of faith is. The profession of faith, and maybe stepping back, in order to be a member of the Catholic Church, you're required to have the three juridical bonds, and sometimes it's just referred to as the threefold bond of the profession of faith, of worship, unity of worship, and governance, the legal aspects of the church. You have to have all three to be a member of the Catholic Church. The profession of faith refers to the first of the threefold juridical bond. Profession of the faith does not mean one's ability to orally articulate Catholic doctrine. That is not at all what it means. And it's amazing, but many traditional Catholics have that understanding. Let's be clear about this. The profession of faith means that one has been formally received into the Catholic Church. That is the profession of faith. How does formal reception occur? It occurs through a valid baptism in the Catholic Church. And when you're validly baptized, what happens? There's a profession of faith that's made. Either the godparents make it on behalf of the infant, or as an adult, the adult makes it. So the profession of faith means you've been formally received into the Catholic Church through valid baptism and the profession. You see, that is what forms the juridical bond. And it forms all three, because now I'm not only bound by my profession, I'm also united in worship and subject to the governance of the church under my local bishop. So it has nothing to do with the oral articulation of the faith. You see, this deals with formal reception into the Roman Catholic Church. And I don't hear this being explained this way, but you can read all of the theology manuals. It's crystal clear. It's also important to note that this bond exists unless it is severed either through a declaration by the church, or if one openly leaves the church and joins the schismatic sect. Okay. It remains. It's extremely difficult to sever unless you're either declared excommunicated or you excommunicate yourself through a notorious act. And I can get into that too. But it's not severed by making heretical statements. That doesn't sever the juridical bond. Okay. It's not severed by falling away from the practice of the faith. Somebody may be away from the faith for 40 years. They haven't severed the juridical bond if they haven't joined a non-Catholic sect or been declared by their bishop excommunicated. They're still Catholic. Even if they believe heretical ideas or profess them, they're still Catholic, because again, the juridical bond is not severed unless one is either cut off by the church's judgment or openly leaves the church. That's rock solid Catholic teaching. It's based on Bellarmine. It's based on Pope Pius XII and Mystici Corpus Christi. You can read, he clearly says it. One has to be either openly leave or be cut off by the church. And so a valid baptism in a Protestant church, I often hear some of my fellow Catholic apologists say, when that Protestant baby's baptized in a Protestant church, that baby's a Catholic and they just don't know about it. That's not true. That's not true. That baby is not a member of the Roman Catholic Church. That baby, if the baptism is valid, that baby is in a state of grace. It is spiritually united to the church. It has faith, hope, and charity, but it doesn't have the legal union with the church. It doesn't have the juridical bonds of the profession, of worship, and of governance. So it's validly baptized and it's ordered to the church, but it's not a member of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is why when a Protestant converts to the Catholic faith, there's first an investigation as to whether the baptism is valid. And if it is, what else has to happen? They have to make a profession of faith, you see, and that's because they weren't members of the Catholic Church before. The same thing can be said for an SSPX adherent. Let's say somebody was raised in the SSPX, okay, and many people have been. I think you guys were. If you were raised in the SSPX and you were validly baptized, you did not make a profession of faith. You were not formally received into the Roman Catholic Church. So you didn't establish the juridical bond. Okay, you have a valid baptism and you may be in a state of grace, but you must be formally received into the Roman Catholic Church. And that's why I've talked to priests about this. When somebody's raised in the society and they want to come to the church, as an adult, they're required to make a profession of faith, assuming the baptism is valid. Oh, you want to get married in the diocesan church, but you were baptized in the society, you've only gone to the society, you've never been in a parish. They're going to be required to make a profession of faith. It's the profession of faith coupled with baptism, which means reception into the Roman Catholic Church, that forms the juridical bond, you see? And that's what unites one to the Roman Catholic Church. Schism severs the juridical bond. And that can happen in one of two ways, okay? And either can happen in the ecclesiastical forum. I'm not talking about the internal forum now, where if, you go to confession, but it can happen in the ecclesiastical forum where the schismatic is either, as I mentioned, it's technically called a schismatic by a notoriety of law, where the schism is actually declared by the authority and the excommunication is declared, or one can be a schismatic by what's called a notoriety of fact. And what that means is that the act itself suffices for a declaration by the authority without a canonical trial. What the church has said in this regard is, if someone, and I'm not saying someone who's declared a schismatic, but if someone joins a schismatic sect in the external forum, okay, and this is manifested externally, they would sever their juridical bond with the church if they had the bond. By joining a non-Catholic sect, a schismatic sect, they do sever the juridical bond, even without a declared excommunication, you see? So again, this can happen not just in the internal forum, but it also can happen in the external forum without a declaration. Now, again, without getting into too much detail, if one was a Catholic and formally received, it's likely that a priest would simply be able to absolve them in the confessional, right? And they would be reintegrated in the church. But again, if that juridical bond was never formed because they were raised in a sedevacantist sect or in the society, they have to form the juridical bond to be received into the church. This is what rejoins them or joins them de novo in the church because they weren't members before. So the bottom line is, schism results in excommunication, and the excommunication can apply both in the internal and external forum, depending on the facts and circumstances. It's extremely serious, and it's based on the teachings of John Paul II and the entire tradition of the church.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. So we're going to cover some objections in just a bit here, but I wanted to kind of recap here. So Andrew laid out the historical, the moral position on schism, and the actions that he's listed, the quotes, the things that were said. John, you've laid out the canonical status, the how the external forum and the internal forum work, and how that applies to other instances. But so real quick, one last thing I want to ask you more about, John, is this this establishment of a tribunal by the society. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because if I'm not mistaken, that has some ramifications on what we're talking about here, some pretty serious ones.
Well, it's called the sin of usurpation. That's what St. Thomas would call it, and all the other theologians would call it. The society is appropriating to itself authority that it doesn't have, and this is grave. I mean, think about it. I'm a civil lawyer, but let's just say I decide to start, my own civil courts, and that's not a good example because I'm actually admitted to the bar and licensed to practice law. But let's say somebody has a law degree, but they're not licensed to practice. The parallels, they have no canonical mission. They're not incarnated. And let's say, they say, I don't trust the civil courts. I'm going to start my own civil court. And I'm going to render judgments. I mean, think about the absurdity of this. And that's even not a good parallel because we're dealing with civil matters in my analogy, but the society's dealing with spiritual matters. They're dealing with grave spiritual matters that affect the eternal welfare of these adherents. I mean, determining whether there's a marriage impediment, rendering marriage annulments, dispensing one from religious vows and lifting censures that they have no authority to do. These are grave, grave matters. And I can say this, I have personal experience with their canonical mission, okay? And it was one of the most horrible situations I've had as a practicing attorney. I'll say no more, but it is grave and it is serious. And don't let the society tell you that they're acting as consultants and they're just consulting people. That's not true. They have them swear on the Gospels to abide by their decisions. This is one of the dirty little secrets of the Society of St. Pius X, and it should be exposed for what it is. It is a schismatic tribunal. It is a parallel church. I refer to this as the false church of tradition. It's an entire usurpation of the legitimate authorities of those in the Catholic Church.
Okay, great. So I think this is a good time to transition to certain common objections that we've heard here and there. Obviously, this list won't be exhaustive, but I'm going to ask respective questions to you, Andrew, and to you, John. So starting with Andrew, let's see. I want to ask you, Andrew. People have said to me, and I'm sure to you, right? Disobedience is not schism. How would you respond to that?
Yes. Yeah, this is probably the most common one that's brought up, and so I'm glad you brought it up first. It's commonly said that, well, if you were to say that, like Christopher Ferrara, notably I can think of, and I think it was the Great Facade in the chapter on schism, he brought this up, but this is the one that's most commonly brought up by the society. And I addressed it a little bit at the beginning of my presentation, which is that it is not schismatic to simply disobey, because you can see throughout history, there have been many times when Catholics have disobeyed, but that does not place them in a state of schism. That does not in and of itself constitute a schismatic act. And that is true, because just disobeying, if a child disobeys their mother, it's not a complete withdrawal from, the authority of the mother. It's an act of disobedience. It's an isolated act. This does not, however, apply to the situation of the Society of St. Pius X or other such groups who have been operating for years in a state of disobedience. Repeated acts of disobedience and refusing to ever obey in important matters is what constitutes a withdrawal of submission. And that does not require that you deny the authority's right to command. That's another misconception that's commonly brought up is, well, we don't deny the Pope's authority. As a matter of fact, we pray for him. We say his name in the Mass. We have his picture hung up in the sanctuary. And if he was to call us to Rome, we'll go and we'll meet with him in Rome, right? We acknowledge his authority as the Vicar of Christ, and we recognize it. But that fails to distinguish between active and passive schism. So active schism is where you would explicitly reject it, such as the Orthodox, and say, we think you're the first among equals, but you don't actually have any kind of power over us. But the passive schism is the kind that in one's actions, one withdraws from the authority and refuses submission, even if one continues to recognize the Pope's authority. In practice, it is a practical denial. So in the quote, for example, that's usually brought up in the Catholic Encyclopedia, what that means, I think it was St. Jerome. It was St. Jerome that said that it entails that schism entails a denial of the authority to command. That has to be read in the context of the other teaching on schism, which is that you can both have a denial of the right to command expressly by means of one's words or declaring that, you don't have the authority to command me, or indirectly or passively by means of one's actions. And that's the category that the Society of St. Pius X definitely finds itself in.
I see. So actually, this leads me to a good follow-up question for you, Andrew. So some have told me that the SSPX has never been declared to be in schism by the church today, right? And us laymen cannot do so on our own authority. So Andrew, you're a layman. You do not have the authority to say this. John, same. Me, same thing.
Yes.
What do you say to this?
That's exactly right. None of us do have the authority to make a declaration, especially a canonical declaration, that the SSPX are in schism. None of us have that authority. There's a difference between making an official declaration with authority, and there's a difference between recognizing a manifest sin or a manifest crime. So we have to distinguish between, again, making a declaration as though one has authority. Similar to the state of Acontis do, right? Where, I declare, although they say they're just recognizing that the Pope is no longer the Pope, in essence, practically, for all intents and purposes, they are saying that Pope's no longer Pope. And so they withdraw from that, and they don't no longer recognize that person as Pope, right? That would be an example of saying, I declare, and that you're no longer Pope, and so now I can start my own little church, and you act as though you'd made an official declaration, right? So we're not making any kind of official declaration, and I think where the confusion comes in is that yes, we are as individuals declaring. You might say we're making declarative sentences that right. The SSPX is in schism, but we're not saying that authoritatively. We're saying that simply by being able to apply the tradition, to apply the principles of union, to be able to recognize whether or not someone is or is not acting either in line with the law of the church or the law of God. The second part of this is that our decision is actually confirmed by those who are in authority. There is a common lie out there, and ironically, Kennedy Hall, in his video, You Were Lied To About the SSPX, perpetuates this lie, which is that you cannot find anywhere from any declaration by the Pope that the SSPX are in schism. That is completely false. You can find it in both motu proprios or I should say all three motu proprios by the popes dealing with the Society of St. Pius X and the 1962 Rite of Mass. So Pope John Paul II in his letter Ecclesia Afflicta, that one is the most clear, that the decision or his declaration that the society had committed a schismatic act, which makes you a schismatic, has never been denied by any subsequent popes. So his declaration that it was a schismatic act and that they had broken away as schismatics still retains effect. And then subsequently, this decision or declaration that it is a schism has been said by Pope Benedict XVI in his letter accompanying Summorum Pontificum, as well as Pope Francis in his letter accompanying Traditionis Custodes. All of them use the explicit terminology schism. They do not have to make an explicit declaration for, as John mentioned, to recognize that the excommunication has already taken effect. There does not have to be an explicit declaration of schism for there to be a schism. And the recognition by all of the popes that it has been a schism in official documents proves this.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to reiterate, people out there who disagree with us, who hold to different positions, please reach out to us, talk to us. We're willing to talk. We're willing, because this is not like us in our bubble bashing on people we disagree with. No, we want us to be united in the family, which is the church. Talk to us. Let's hash this out, right? We're brothers and sisters in Christ. We're not here to sow division. We're doing this for the opposite reason. So I just want to put that out there because, we are an open door. And so, but I want to move on to a different question here for John. This one, John, is, so an objection here is the excommunications have been lifted. Therefore, the SSPX is not in schism anymore. Actually, John, you've already covered that. Yeah. So let's move on to a different one here. Let's see. Okay, this one is interesting. So Pope Francis has given faculties to the SSPX for confessions and marriages. Therefore, they must be Catholics in good standing. What do you say, John?
No, that's absolutely not true. The popes have said just the opposite. When Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications in the external forum, he still said the society has no canonical status and its ministry is illegitimate. Francis said effectively the same thing, and he said he was granting faculties because he was concerned for the salvation of those going to confessions in the society chapels, since they didn't have supplied jurisdiction, even though they claimed they did for the last 45 years. but also to further effect reconciliation as another extra step that the church takes toward the society to bring them into the church. And the other thing.
John, you cut out, I think. Oh, you're back. You cut out, John.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the other thing is that being a heretic or a schismatic, there's no metaphysical incompatibility with that state and with jurisdiction. That's another important, and this is again what the theologian and the canonists repeatedly teach, especially for a cleric. So the Pope can delegate faculties whoever he wishes. And to the extent that he's given the society faculties for confessions and marriages, the society does act licitly and validly in those limited circumstances. But they're still without canonical mission. The priests are still not incarnated, and so they do not have the priestly faculties to preach, to baptize, to say mass, all of the faculties that come by virtue of general law when a person is incarnated, that is attached to a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. So the problem remains, and granting limited faculties in limited cases does not justify the entire ministry, as the popes have been clear.
Okay. Great. So let's see. I have some more objections here, and this one goes: Cardinal Gagnon and Bishop Athanasius Schneider and Cardinal Huyos have all stated that the SSPX are not in schism and are good Catholics. And these are the opinions that matter. John and Andrew, if you want to pitch in. But John, what do you think?
What about the popes that Andrew just referred to that said they were in schism? Do they matter?
That's always been my response.
Yeah, I mean, come on here. I mean, does Cardinal Burke matter? I mean, Cardinal Burke is one of the most charitable and learned men in Rome. And he has an extremely balanced approach when he evaluates this. And he's right on when he says, again, because the contumacy persists, the schism persists. He recognizes the external declared censure has been lifted, but we've already proved all of the canonical elements of schism still remain. So let's defer to John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I think I will take those over these clerics.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, there's a reason.
Also the overwhelming number of clerics would give you, and bishops would give you, the opinion that the SSPX is in schism. Yeah. So these are certainly exceptional. These are certain exceptional cases. The consensus of cardinals, such as Cardinal Mueller, Cardinal like Cardinal Burke, as you brought up, and the popes and multiple bishops would share the exact same opinion. So if it's going to be an opinions contest, the opinions definitely are more on the side of the SSPX being in schism.
And the church provides for when there's differing opinions. We have a court of appeal. I mean,
yeah.
We have a juridical structure. This is nothing new. Okay, guys in the chat, before I get to your questions, make sure you put at the Logos Project, or I won't be able to answer your question. And if you put a question before I said to put questions, go ahead and re-put that question. Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? I have a question for you, John, again. It says here, the head of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, Edward Cardinal Cassidy, issued a statement in 1994 saying, quote, "The status of the society is the internal matter of the Catholic Church, and it is not another church or community in the sense used in this directory. Therefore, the society is not in schism." What would you say to this, John?
Isn't that organ of the church completely modernist? Isn't Cassidy a modernist? Why would we care what they say, right? I mean, that's,
I don't know.
I'm being facetious here, right? They always use what is to their benefit. Look, I side with the magisterium of John Paul II. That's not an authoritative statement on schism, nor does it make the proper distinctions between whether they've been excommunicated in the internal form versus the external form. And if they're not excommunicated by virtue of a declared censure, are they at least excommunicated by virtue of separating from the church by being legally part of this schismatic sect? It doesn't address any of those necessary distinctions to really address the question, right?
Yeah.
But we do have John Paul II's magisterial declaration, whereby he says those who formally adhere to the society incur the censure of excommunication for schism. Okay,
Yeah.
that's where it begins and ends for me as the declaration from the supreme authority.
Yeah, not only that, but it's interesting how the apologists for the SSPX continue to recycle these opinions that have been given, whether by authoritative bodies or not, that have. I mean, this was over 25 years ago that this opinion was given. There have been a lot of developments since then. So you can't just take a quote and say, oh, this applies, right? You have another 25 years of repeated acts of disobedience and withdrawal of submission. I mean, that it's compounding. I mean, at this point, since the society's founding and everything that began to take place a short 5 years after it was erected, this situation has just been getting more and more grave.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because I keep getting the same kind of bullet points. Athanasius, supply jurisdiction, crisis, crazy times,
recycling the same ones over and over again.
It's like watch our videos carefully, and we address these. Okay, and they do not work. But okay, anyway. So another question for you, John. It says here in my notes. Monsignor Pearl, head of Ecclesia Commission, declared that a Catholic can fulfill their Sunday obligation at SSPX masses and even offer a tithe. What do you say to that, John?
He issued a private letter to a private individual who had no recourse to any priest with faculties. Okay, he issued that letter in September of 2002. When that letter was leaked and published and used by the society to justify their masses as fulfilling the Sunday obligation, what did Monsignor Pearl do? He came out less than 4 months later on January of 2003 and reiterated that one cannot attend the society masses, that was intended as a private communication for a particular circumstance. And all that letter meant is for this particular individual that because he had no recourse to other priests or other masses, he could use that in fulfillment of the divine law. Okay, if that person would have asked, can I pray 15 decades of the rosary instead? I'm sure Monsignor Pearl would have said the same thing. In the strict sense, you can fulfill your obligation by praying the rosary or going to this church or doing some other act of charity or penance to fulfill the divine law. But it never fulfills the ecclesiastical precept because under Canon 1248, one must worship in union with the local bishop in a lawfully established Catholic church. Right. So Monsignor Pearl, he headed that off by coming out and saying, you totally, first of all, wasn't intended for the church. I have about 8 other Ecclesia Dei replies that say just the opposite. They're all intended publicly for the universal church, and yet the society and its apologists only focus on one letter that was private as opposed to all the other letters that were public saying just the opposite, that one cannot attend the society masses to fulfill the obligation, that if one receives communion at a society mass, they're committing sacrilege, they have to abstain from communion. The only concession that's been given is if one attends a society mass not for the purpose of satisfying the obligation, let's say going there on a Saturday or a weekday, and still we need clarification on that because they don't make a distinction between active versus passive participation. If you look at the entire canonical tradition of the church, actively participating in masses that are illicit are sinful. You are not allowed to do that as Catholics. So the overwhelming guidance, and it's just about 100%, other than this one leaked Pearl letter to a private, situation, says that we cannot attend society masses.
Yeah, that's pretty decisive. Yeah. So Andrew or John, this one's for both of you. Let's see. In the Hawaii case in 1993, Cardinal Ratzinger ruled that the 6 Catholics who had attended the masses of the SSPX were not guilty of schism. I'll start with you, Andrew. What do you think?
Yes. So it's very important to look at the wording because, of course, it says in the strict sense, it did not in and of itself constitute a schismatic act. So the ruling was not necessarily a recommendation to go to SSPX masses or receive sacraments from them, as much as it was a acknowledgement that the bishop had been too harsh in excommunicating the Catholics merely for this for these isolated acts of going to the SSPX and attending their sacraments and receiving sacraments from them, because just going, and doing that does not in and of itself constitute an act of schism. An act of schism for a layperson with regards to the Society of St. Pius X would be to exclusively go to, and obviously that makes sense in this particular situation, because if they were going exclusively to the SSPX, they wouldn't care that they were excommunicated.
Right.
I mean, they would see it as a badge of honor. So it shows that it was isolated actions of Catholics, and so it did not in and of itself constitute schism.
Yeah. So in that case, the authorities determined that they had not externally separated from the church. When John Paul II says whoever formally adheres incurs excommunication for schism, it was determined in this particular fact pattern that there was not formal adherence. That doesn't mean that there's never formal adherence. Again, as I've stated before, the clergy clearly are formally adhering, and many of the SSPX only crowd is also formally adhering. So again, this is driven by the particular facts and circumstances of each case.
Wonderful. Okay, another one for both of you. The SSPX have been given permission to say Mass in St. Peter's and other major churches and basilicas. John, what do you think about this?
Well, if that is true, it would only be yet another overture of the Holy See to try to bring them into the Catholic Church. By granting these concessions, again, they haven't been given a canonical mission. None of their priests are incarnated, which is the universal law of the church that is required for them to licitly exercise their ministry. You know, they're grasping for straws when they're exploiting these concessions that are given to them, not to justify their ministry, but to say, please come to the Catholic Church where you can do your ministry licitly. So again, I look at these as acts, ecumenical acts to bring them back. But again, they remain, as Pope Benedict said, without mission and without the priests being incarnated.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear. Like, you have all these actions from the Holy See, coming from the Holy See, that are reconciliatory. They're trying to bring them back in, but the Holy See is also very clear in saying you have no canonical mission.
Yeah.
You have no rights to operate apart from the juridical legal structure visible structure of the church. You're hearing both things, and we're saying exactly what the church is saying. We're also attempting to do what the church is doing, but by calling this out, saying, "Come home." This is our way of saying, "Come home," So, okay.
Yeah, and many have talked about how during Pope Benedict's reign, he was actually thinking of excommunicating all the society again. That was something that was being discussed about as they were going through, these so-called theological discussions. And when it was manifest that they would not accept the 1989 Profession of Faith or collegiality, among other things, some have said that was being considered. So.
Wow.
Again, these overtures are meant for their integration into the Catholic Church, not to remain where they are, which is outside the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Okay, another one here. If any of you two need to go, let me know. If not, I'll go ahead and proceed with these questions. So this one objection here, Andrew, this is for you. We have the duty to resist and disobey the Pope and bishops when it comes into conflict with a higher law of God. Therefore, we are justified. I hear this from oftentimes from proponents of the society.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, that's the same argumentation that was used by, any heretic and schismatic in history has used, that they have a higher duty to the Bible or tradition or to their own patriarch or whatever it is, to separate themselves from the Holy Catholic Church. We are supposed to be formed by the church, not the other way around. The church saves us. We don't save the church. And this was a fundamental error made by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, was that he believed that he had to save the church, that God had given him the mission to continue the true Catholic faith, because the men whom Christ gave the keys to the kingdom of God and said that the gates of hell would not prevail against it, the gates of hell had prevailed. So now he had become the new rock. And whether or not he said that explicitly, which he even explicitly said, I don't want to set up myself, far from me to set myself up as Pope. But then he goes and in practice sets himself up as the leader of the true church. So we are called to be submissive and to be obedient to the pastors who have been given the mission by God for the sake of our souls. And we're called to form our consciences according to that authentic sensus fidei that's handed on through the interpretive power and authority of the magisterium. We cannot set ourselves up as little magisteriums in opposition to the Pope and all the bishops in union with him. That's what started this whole mess that became the traditionalist schism, which now it's splintering into more and more, and bishops are being made and consecrated by rogue bishops, and it's creating the disaster that is Orthodox, the chaos that is Orthodox Christianity or Protestant Christianity, constant splintering, no principle of authority because everyone has become their own principle of authority. And that's the danger. I mean, that's one of the ironic things about what happened after the 2012 split, when Bishop Williamson was expelled from the SSPX, left, and then multiple resistance priests left. And then Bishop Williamson proceeded to consecrate another bishop. The SSPX found themselves in the very awkward situation of condemning the consecration of the bishop by Bishop Williamson according to the same principles that Archbishop Lefebvre had made them bishops.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And the society can't say they're appealing to a higher law or divine law, because the divine law requires bishops and priests to be lawfully sent to carry out the mission. You cannot divorce the salvation of souls from the mission of the church, because the mission of the church is for the purpose of saving souls. You see, you can't divorce the two. And so the appeal to divine law does not work in this case. What they're doing is they're circumventing the divine law, just like the rest of the heretics and schismatics of history.
Yeah, and this comes hand in hand with a lot of questions that people have about, okay, I see what you're saying, John, I see what you're saying, Andrew, but how do we understand what happened at the council, the reforms, the encyclicals of the modern popes? I see tension here and not here, and there's confusion. How do I make sense of all this? Well, this is exactly, hopefully, what this channel is set out to do. This is exactly what this channel sets out to do, which is to present you the lead up, the causes, the reasons, and the theology of the council and the encyclicals of the modern popes, to explain great theologians of the past and of the present, and to try to shed clarity on what the church actually teaches. And so I have a lot of episodes forthcoming that's going to take a deep dive and explicate Holy Mother Church's current stance and teaching, and to show you how it is in conformity with the past, with some reversals for the sake of reformation, right? But there is a continuity, but there's also a call for reform. So there's also a kind of discontinuity, but for the sake of a greater continuity. And I mean, this is off topic, but what I'm saying is that I hear a lot of people in the audience. I'm not listening to you. There are questions out there, and I want to provide you as best I can with some of those answers, and with my guests as well. That being said, I have one more objection for you two, and then we'll go to questions. So the last objection is, Andrew, the fruit of the SSPX are better than the Novus Ordo Church. Therefore, they are the true Catholics. What do you say to that?
Yes, this one is definitely a common one thrown around. It really needs to be retired, because the fruits argument is very, very subjective. I mean, you can find good fruits in multiple ecclesial communities outside of the Catholic Church. I mean, the Mormon Church, the Pentecostal Church, you can find all kinds of good fruits. So the fruits are meant to be a criteria in conjunction with the other criteria. So a point I have made, and I want to continue to make, is don't take any one rule of faith and make it that your only rule of faith, and rely too heavily on that. That is not Catholicism. That is an ideology. Catholicism is a complexus. It's a tapestry of different rules of faith. And for anyone who's interested in a great introduction to this, you can go to St. Francis de Sales' book, The Catholic Controversy. He talks about a lot of the different rules of faith. You have to take them all together. So the fruits argument has to be taken in conjunction with all of the others. And in the other areas, as far as the rules of faith is concerned, the SSPX fails over and over again. And the claim that there are not good fruits within the Novus Ordo church, as it's called from the SSPX side, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And once I left that limiting worldview, that narrow circle, as G.K. Chesterton calls it, my eyes were opened to all of the beautiful things that are happening in the church, the holy people, the conversions, everything, because I wasn't just being fed constant poison and anti-church that I encountered.
Yeah, there's the shaft and the grain, and I concur. I've seen so many good fruits. I mean, the theology on the Blessed Virgin Mary contained in Lumen Gentium, her relationship to the church that Lumen Gentium put forth. One of the fruits of that is the conversion of one of my friends from Protestantism to the Catholic Church. That's a long story, but that's just one. I know it's just one example, but no, there's fruits out there, and I see them all the time. So it's not all doom and gloom. We need to broaden our horizons.
And kind of in line with this, along the same line, I really want to emphasize as well that just because there are terrible things that are done by churchmen, corruption, infiltration, because this is a major argument as well. All of the Freemasons, the modernists, all of this corruption. Look at what this bishop is doing. Look at this gay mass. Look at these sacrileges. And we, as the most connected century ever seen before, we are in touch with everything that's going on, and we can inundate ourselves with all kinds of awful sacrileges, and maybe even imprudently done by even the Pope himself, such as that bizarre ceremony that took place, with the Indians in Canada recently, right? But that has never been. You can never do something wrong, and this point has to be emphasized: is you can never do something wrong to achieve a good end. So schism is never justified, ever, no matter how bad it gets or how many sacrilegious and perfidious men. And I just want to read this one quotation from St. Augustine, because I think I have it here somewhere, because he said this explicitly. You can find a quote. I don't see it in my notes right here.
I know what quote you're referring to. I don't remember it, though.
It's the one. You can find it in the Catholic Encyclopedia on schism, I believe it is. But he says it's breaking communion with the church is never justified, even because of sacrilegious and perfidious men. Absolutely. So that's straight from St. Augustine. Schism is never justified. So find another solution, because the SSPX and other schismatic traditionalist groups, that ain't it.
Well, the spiritual masters will also tell you that to the extent that churchmen perform evil acts, if it actually affects us in a way that's harmful to our faith, that's an example of diabolical indirect oppression from the demons. The demons prey on our emotions and can control them to the extent we're reacting to these things. And so a lot of these people don't realize it, but they've overreacted and fallen into the hands of the demons and the diabolical in their overreaction to this. And this is a test, guys. This is a test of faith. I think we also need to mention that much of the fruit of the society is rotten. And we can say this, and you and I, and we've all lived through some of this stuff. You listen to Father Ripperger about, all of the spiritual maladies that plague traditionalist Catholics, how unhappy they are, how, they've habituated their intellect to focus solely on the negative. Everything is always about the negative and the judgmental, and there's a lack of charity. And that lack of charity is the effect of schism, the external separation from the church. There's a lack of charity there. And so it's not all good. Much of it is rotten. And I would say the ultimate rotten fruit of the society is that it actually leads people where? Outside of the Catholic Church. Outside of which there's no salvation. You want to talk about good fruits? The most rotten fruit of all is those who leave the Roman Catholic Church and imperil their salvation. That's what the society leads to.
Yeah. And I remember Kennedy Hall in that video he made, making fun of a comment that I made in my debate with Jeff Kastman, that there is a sickness, that there is a disease. I mean, I was just continuing to, I was just saying what Father Ripperger and other exorcists I have met who have encountered traditionalist Catholics who have entrenched themselves in the movement, as well as my own experience of the darkness that myself and my family encountered in that these are the effects of schism. It is a deep wound on charity, and charity affects every aspect of your spiritual and emotional and physical life even.
Yeah, we should really turn to the Blessed Mother and entrust this conversation to her and pray for our brothers and sisters that, on the left or the right. And again, I hate those categories, left and right.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Yes.
But we really do need to pray more and turn to the Blessed Mother that she can lead us to the center, which is Christ. And I mean, that's a big part of the Second Vatican Council. It was very Christocentric. It was trying to re-emphasize and shift things back onto Christ because we had lost sight of the centrality of Christ, and we had become kind of apathetic. But that's a different conversation.
No, that's great. That's great, Tom. And before we get into questions, I would just like to ask anyone who is watching this, please feel free, share this with traditionalist clergy, whether they be SSPX, SSPV, CMRI, share it widely, because on behalf of myself and John Salza, we would like to challenge anyone, whether laymen or clergy, to debate us either on schism or the mission, whether either canonical or divine. We would like to extend that invitation and challenge, because the truth needs to be known about this, and I want it to be communicated as well, that we have a rock solid case, and we're willing to take anyone to task in a public debate on that.
Wonderful. All
Amen.
right. Well, gentlemen, I'm going to turn to questions. Again, let me know if you have to go. We have a few here. I won't cover all of them, but the first one we have is from Peter. Peter says, Rome refers to the SSPX as not in full communion with the Catholic Church. Is the expression not in full communion the same as in schism, but using different words? What do you think, John?
Well, as applied to the Society of St. Pius X, the answer is yes. They're externally separated from the Church, which is effectively and essentially the definition of schism.
Got it.
Yeah. So you can either have full communion or perfect communion or imperfect communion. And this is what is referred to, because many people like to bring up, well, either you're Catholic or you're not. And that is true. I mean, as far as juridically, you are either Catholic or you're not. So you're either in imperfect or perfect communion. So that means you're either in communion or you're not. That's what that means. Perfect or imperfect communion means you either in communion or not. The term partial communion has to do with those certain elements that we share with other ecclesial communions, while not sharing the fullness of communion, right? So we share we share the same valid Eucharist and sacraments with the Orthodox, right? But we are in imperfect communion with them, right? So we have to understand that you're talking about two different things. There's juridical membership, and then there are also the elements of truth and grace that belong to the Church that can be found outside of the juridical confines. You have to make that distinction.
And as I mentioned, there's also a distinction between the spiritual bond and the legal bond to the Church. One might not be a legal member of the Church, but that person may have faith, hope, and charity in their soul, such as the Protestant baby, who is not a member of the Catholic Church, but if validly baptized, is in a state of grace. And so there's a distinction there as well.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the Orthodox, Andrew, because this was really what Lumen Gentium, especially paragraph 8, set out to do, which is to say there are ecclesial elements outside the visible juridical structures of the Catholic Church, and there is grace there, as you said, John, because you have valid sacraments. You can have instances of the presence of faith, hope, and charity in the soul of the baptized person. So this is why. So at first there was some progressives at the council who tried to push for the term ad est in Latin, which means the Church of Christ is present in the Catholic Church, but they said no, that won't do because of our ecclesiology. It's subsistit, which means its fullness is in the Catholic Church, but there are ecclesial elements, including elements of grace outside of its visible bounds,
which is a more consistent position,
absolutely,
than just an either or. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Next question here. We have a question from Rob. John, you have said the SSPX rejects the Confession of Faith of John Paul II for clergy. Is this creed still used today for priests, and where or when does the SSPX reject it?
Yes, that refers to the 1989 Profession of Faith promulgated by John Paul II. It is a universal profession of faith. And so everybody in the East and the West who's a Roman Catholic must have this profession of faith. It's also required for anybody who holds offices in the church. The profession of faith is comprised of three primary articles, the first of which is one must believe as a matter of divine and Catholic faith anything that the church proposes is divinely revealed. The second category is we must firmly hold to anything that the church renders as a definitive judgment. Both those are a sense of faith. And the third category is what the society rejects. The third category is simply to the extent that the magisterium teaches authentically, even though non-definitively, one must at least give a religious submission of intellect and will. Well, the society rejects that, and yet that's considered part of revelation, part of the deposit of faith, because Christ has told us, hear the church. He who hears you hears me. If you have a problem with your brother, you take it to the church. You hear the church. And so, of course, what Catholic would say that he doesn't have to give religious submission to authentic teachings of the magisterium? This, though, is what the society explicitly rejects, because they mistaken it for the false premise that they have to unconditionally accept every single thing of Vatican II. Well, to the extent there's something in a conciliar document that's not considered a teaching or a doctrine, okay, much less a definitive teaching or a doctrine, while you don't have to assent to it with faith, right? It may be something that's developed, it may be something that's being debated. But to specifically answer the question, the society rejects the profession of faith because they reject the third category, which is as true as the first two.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would agree with you. There's elements in Gaudium et Spes that are cultural, that I would say are contextual and somewhat questionable, I would say, when it comes to the naivete of the Council of Fathers. But, if we had been there at that time, I think it would have been the same for us. There's so much you can't foresee. Councils aren't some kind of divine revelation in the minds of the people who assemble there. No, so I would agree with you, John, on that point. Here's a very important question from Ashley. What would an SSPX priest have to do canonically for reconciliation and incarnation into a proper diocese? The reason why I think this question is important before I ask you, John, is because what if there is a SSPX priest who watches our video or who does some digging, some studying, and decides, you know what? Yes, I cannot hold to this. I need to reconcile with the church. What should they do?
Well, I think because they're clergy in the society and they're externally separated without mission or incarnation, they would have to go to the local bishop to rectify the situation. And there may be a distinction. If somebody was, as I mentioned, formally received into the Catholic Church, they were Catholic and then became a priest of the society and so forth. Normally you would be able to resolve that in the sacrament of confession. But I believe because they're clergy and because they are externally separated and they've been carrying out an illicit ministry contrary to the laws of the church, that would have to be regularized through the local bishop. They would have to actually probably renounce their errors, make a profession of faith, be incorporated into the church, and then subjected to the local bishop, who then would have the ability to incarnate them and give them a lawful ministry in the church. So my answer would be, go to the bishop, go to the princes of the church. They are so powerful. They really are the fonts of grace for the Catholic Church. When you think about it, the Pope and the bishops they're the conduits of grace. So we must start there.
Excellent. This question here asks, did John say that if an infant was baptized in the SSPX, they should make a profession of faith as an adult?
Absolutely, because being baptized outside of the Catholic Church means you haven't been formally received into the Catholic Church, and hence you have not formed the juridical bonds which are necessary to make you a member of the Catholic Church. I'm not saying they're not in a state of grace. They may be ignorant of this and not have culpability. But if the juridical bond was not formed, which means you were never received formally into the Catholic Church, into a diocesan parish, let's say, they would absolutely have to go to the local parish and be received. If they have a valid baptism, it's likely that the parish priest would require them to make a profession of faith in order to form that juridical bond so they become a member of the church.
So would you say that if they for the first time find this out, should they go to their parish priest and explain the situation and ask if they can make a profession of faith in their parish?
Yes, ask the priest that you want to be formally received into the Catholic Church. You've been existing outside of the church, you want to be formally received. The priest is then going to ask for proof of a valid baptism. An investigation will be made to determine whether the baptism was valid. The society baptisms are valid. I've witnessed them myself, of course. And so the only step then would be a formal reception into the diocesan parish.
Okay. Let's see. So traditional Catholics only care about what bishops such as Archbishop Schneider say because they view him as traditional, but they can't care what the popes or bishops say because they are seen as modernist. So the commentator says that this means that they see their opinion as irrelevant. Thus, this kind of constitutes a cult attitude, you might say, kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Seclusive, I guess, attitude. So, and then it's a cult of personality based on people's emotion. It's not really a question, but it's an observation. But would you concur with that, John and Andrew?
I would. I mean, as I've said before, when it comes down to it, the society clergy use Archbishop Lefebvre as the rule of faith. The rule of faith is not the Roman Catholic Church or the magisterium, it's Archbishop Lefebvre. I mean, I mentioned the tribunals before. You know what Bishop Tissier says that their authority is for the tribunals? He says, the authority of our founder, and I'm quoting from memory, the authority of our founder is sufficient to erect these tribunals. That's because Archbishop Lefebvre is indeed their rule of faith.
Yeah.
I think Prisca is also highlighting something very important, which is a hypocrisy on the part of radical traditionalists, which is they will accept statements made in their favor by the same men that they would normally be screaming and frothing at the mouth about. They would like that they consider as modernists. But it's definitely authoritative. You should take these men as authoritative, when they say something nice about us. But then, when Pope Francis says something else, then, we scream and we completely reject his authority. It's a weird kind of hypocrisy where it's like, oh, I take this, but not that. Same person. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I have witnessed that, Andrew, unfortunately, over and over again. It's just, it's just not consistent. So, I have seen that. Here's a question that's really good. John, does the SSPX actually have any real canon lawyers within their organization?
Not to my knowledge. When I worked personally with their canonical mission, nobody was a canon lawyer at all.
Gotcha.
So, no. And all the canonists in Rome that I've consulted with, they're in a 100% agreement with everything that we've said today. In terms of schism, in terms of excommunication, canonical mission, incarnation, supply jurisdiction, and on and on and on. No, the society doesn't have any canon lawyers, to my knowledge.
Okay.
Well, wouldn't they might consider themselves canon lawyers, and they might have like a degree in canon law, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have any kind of status, I guess. Is that what you're saying, John?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not even aware that they even have a licentiate, degree in canon law. I could be wrong, but it makes no difference, right? We're dealing with the true authorities of the church. They obviously have no office or status or mission in the church.
Yeah.
Here's a very, very good question. It says, Father Urban Schneider, among several other priests, was incarnated into the SSPX with Rome's approval. What does this say about the status of the SSPX before their suppression response? What do you think, John?
That's not true. It can't be true because the Society of St. Pius X is not a juridic person capable of receiving priests through incarnation. And if the society disagrees, then let them produce the decree from the Holy See. Okay, what happened with this particular priest is he was a member of the Trappists. And what presumably happened is that the Holy See gave him a decree of exclaustration, which allowed him to leave the Trappist monastery to live in the society. Okay, that's all it was. But then the society would twist something like that and say that they actually received a decree from the Holy See to incarnate this priest in the society. Again, that cannot be true, because the society is not a person capable of receiving priests through incarnation, nor do they have any bishops with the authority to incarnate priests.
What about the recent situation? Because I know a lot of people like bringing this one up, John. What about that recent situation where a bishop apparently retired with the approval of Pope Francis? What was that about?
Yeah, Bishop Vedus it was. And well, if you read the bishop's statement, now the society will publish parts of his statement, but if you actually read the bishop's statement, what he says is he's doing this to try to integrate them into the Catholic Church. This is what the bishop says. He wants to live out the rest of his life saying the traditional Mass. And, he's in good standing with the church, but that doesn't make all the clergy around him in good standing. He specifically said that he's using this as an opportunity to try to integrate them back in the church. And, God willing, that might bear some good fruit.
Yeah, it's a classic case, like so many of the objections we went over, Dom, of saying, well, look at this particular exceptional case, therefore we're good.
Right.
These cases are not proving what people want them to prove. It's really grasping at straws.
Yeah. Okay, so one last question, and then we're going to have to stop the questions. But this one I thought was really good. It goes as follows. How can it be a sin to attend an SSPX Sunday Mass when they have faculties to hear confessions? Surely the same people who go to the SSPX confessions will also be attending their Sunday Mass. John, what do you think about that one?
Well, I think that's why Cardinal Burke called the delegation of faculties an anomaly. Now, not all people who go to society confessions go to their Sunday Masses, so let's be clear about that. I mean, the society does hear confessions outside of Mass times, so that's not the case with everybody. But it is problematic, because to the extent that the same person is attending the Mass to fulfill the Sunday obligation, they would not do so. It's a problem. I hearken back to when Pope Francis says he wanted to make a mess, right? This is making a mess. And who knows, who's to say, is there nefarious intent behind this? I doubt it. I mean, Francis is always given the benefit of the doubt, but it makes a terrible situation to the extent these people think they're fulfilling the obligation. But again, it's apples and oranges. Having delegated faculties for confession is not relevant to whether the Mass fulfills the obligation, nor is it relevant to the fact that the society priest does not even have the faculty to say Mass. He's not allowed to say Mass. He's forbidden to say Mass. And that hasn't changed by the delegated faculty. Otherwise, Francis would have delegated them faculties to say Mass, and he didn't.
Yeah. And here's an example that I like to give, because it helps clarify and show the precedent in canon law for this kind of a situation. The obvious intent, and you can find that in Dives et Misericordia from Pope Francis, it was for the sake of mercy, for the sake of the souls of those who adhere, especially exclusively to the SSPX, that they can have valid confessions and valid marriages. And so by having these graces, it would bring them into full communion. He explicitly states that. Mm-hmm. And there is precedent for this in the church's law, that a person can exercise a ministry on a temporary basis. As you've said, John, as soon as Pope Francis dies, if this doesn't continue, it ends with his death. If a priest who is suspended or has even been defrocked and might not even be practicing the Catholic faith, if he encounters a dying person, a dying Catholic who requests the sacraments, he is permitted and given the faculties to licitly offer confession to that dying person for the sake of their soul. That is not a reflection on his standing as a priest, whether or not he is worthy. Again, he's been defrocked, or whether he can then say the Mass. So that's kind of a helpful precedent to understand this kind of a situation.
And it's interesting now that the society is able to licitly and validly absolve. I mean, it was only after that I was given the grace to see these errors. And so maybe some of that grace was attributed to the fact that my confessions were finally valid. Now, as I said before, I wasn't exclusively going to their Masses or confessions, but it's interesting that could be in God's ways, providing the grace to see that this is actually not correct and to lead people out of that situation.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've covered the moral, historical, canonical, case for schism and the Society of St. Pius X. We've tried to bring up as many objections as we could have that we could think of on the spot. That being said, can you give us a closing summary / statement for this episode?
Yes, certainly. We've talked about a lot of elements of the moral law, of canon law, but we have to remember that all of this has to do with Christ. It all has to do with charity. It could be very easy to look at this discussion from the outside and say, "Oh man, they're just obsessed with the law and legalism." And we have to remember that Christ said that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Catholicism is a practice of law and spirit. And all of that we have shared today is for the sake of the unity of the church, that we can again all be one in Christ as Jesus and the Father are one. That's the spirit behind this video. And so I extend the invitation to you, whether you're a SSPX priest, sedevacantist priest, a lay member who has adhered to any of these movements, or even anyone who may be watching this who isn't a traditionalist, who finds themselves out of the physical and juridical confines of the Catholic Church, to come home to the family, to come home to this covenant relationship that is a continuation of the covenant family of God.
Yes, and the Petrine structure of the church protects and safeguards the beauty of the Marian dynamism within, and that Marian dynamism leads us to Jesus, right? So it's ad Jesu per Mariam cum cum Petro, right? So to Jesus through Mary with Peter, and that's really what we're saying. John, what about you? Any concluding statements?
Peter is the rock on which Christ built his church. That's why the popes throughout the centuries have said we cannot be separated from the Roman pontiff without losing our salvation. He truly is the rock of the church. So it must start there. It must start to be united to our local bishop, united to the Holy Father, and in the bark of Peter to save our souls. And that's really what this is about.
Amen. All right. Well, audience, please support us on patreon.com/the Logos Project. Give us a like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell. And we greatly appreciate your viewership and your support. And so without further ado, we'll see you guys next time.